What's going on, everybody? Back with another video. Today we're gonna talk about the synoptic problem. We're gonna dive into a little bit of Christianity today, and specifically we're gonna talk about the Gospels, right? And what we're gonna use as our text is a book I've read some years ago that I had stashed in the archives. It's a critical essay on the Gospel of St. Luke by Dr. Friedrich Schliermacher. All right, so obviously he's German, and he's a theologian, German theologian that is, and we're gonna get into what he has to say. But first, we're gonna introduce, who this guy is, so there's some kind of context, and give him some kind of authority to what he's saying, that he's just not a random theologian, right? So Friedrich Schleiermacher, that's probably how you say it, 1768 to 1834. So of course, he was a German theologian, philosopher, biblical scholar. See, back in those days, guys were Renaissance men, right? They weren't really like specialized. They studied all type of stuff. Guys would be studying, alchemy, philosophy. To them it was like just one big science. It was like the study of nature itself. So you will find a lot of these guys back in the 18th century, 17th century, and they would, studying physics and biology and all type of stuff. And listen, they weren't distracted by social media, so they had time to study nature and find the secrets, find out the secrets of the world. So he was just a man of his time, living in the 19th century. All right, so why is he important? Why did I choose his particular work? He's basically regarded as like the father of modern liberal theology. All right, and his works had a big influence on theology and philosophy in the 19th century, particularly in the field of hermeneutics, which is basically a big word for saying how we interpret the scriptures, basically, right? So hermeneutics, when you hear somebody say, I study hermeneutics, basically is how to interpret the Bible, okay, and scriptures and things of that nature. All right, so basically, now the second part I want to talk about is the synoptic problem. What exactly is the synoptic problem? What does it mean? The synoptic problem basically refers to the question of how to account, right? And I'm trying to be careful. I don't want people to get offended, Christians and all that stuff. But the synoptic problem refers to the question of how to account for some similarities, some indifferences, some might say inconsistencies, right? Among the first three books of the New Testament, which are Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All right, so these three gospels are called the synoptic gospels because they present a synoptic, right? Think of same, synoptic, or similar view of the life and teachings of Jesus, right? So we've often been taught that, hey, these gospels are talking about the life of Jesus from three different viewpoints. All right, and so of course they use identical wording. The structure is the same, and sequence of events. All right. So even though, in spite of these similarities, there's some notable differences between them, both in terms of the details of these shared stories, and the inclusion of the material in each gospel. So this is what people refer to as a synoptic problem. So the core of the problem is to understand how these inconsistencies between these three texts are explained. So scholars have debated this and are still debating it today. all these centuries later. One of the questions is, did the authors of the Gospels copy from one another? And if so, who copied from whom? Right? Did somebody have the original story and the other two say, hey, man, what do you got? And they passed manuscripts around and just copied it. The second major question is, did all three Gospels use a common, a written or oral source? So they might not have copied from each other, but did they just go, to the same spot, download the information, and then, put their own spin on it? All right. And maybe this one source no longer exists. Third question is, how can we explain the differences in the way that similar events are narrated, right? While in other places they're almost identical. All right. So I'm just gonna give you like a few, just a few examples of some. I'll use the term apparent inconsistencies. So, for example, the birth of Jesus. So, if you turn into your Bibles, right, Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 to 23, right, the birth of Jesus includes the visit of the Magi, right, the flight to Egypt, and we're not talking about a plane flight, and Herod's massacre of infants. Now, if you go to Luke chapter 2, verses 1 to 20, it's the same story, right? The birth of Jesus. It includes the visit of the shepherds, the presentation at the temple, and Jesus growing up in Nazareth. But there is no mention of Egypt or Herod's massacre. And so, basically, the inconsistency lies in that Matthew and Luke offer details about Jesus' birth and early life with no overlap between the events of the Magi and the shepherds. And also in Luke, there's no mention of Egypt or Herod's massacre, which you would think would be a huge story. Right, Herod's massacre. And I would go on also to further add that Herod's massacre is not listed in any Roman listed by any Roman historians, such as Flavius Josephus, for example. Right, so I'll leave that there. Another example would be the initial calling of the disciples. If you go to Matthew 4, chapter 18, chapter 4, verses 18 to 22, and Mark chapter 1, 16 to 20, Jesus calls Peter, Andrew, James, and John while they are fishing by the Sea of Galilee. If you go to Luke chapter 5, verses 1 to 11, Jesus performs a miraculous catch of fish before calling the same disciples. And then if you go to the last gospel of John, which is not part of the synoptic gospel, but if you go to John chapter 1, verses 35 to 51, you'll see that it describes Andrew and an unnamed disciple following Jesus after John the Baptist points him out. Andrew then brings his brother Peter to Jesus, but no mention is made of the miraculous catch. Right, again, a big event that happened, and it's just like no mention of it. That's like, I guess the equivalent to me would be like, say me and a friend on the street talking, and then a spaceship lands across the street, and then I write that down because it's such a huge event. Hey, while me and my buddy were talking, a spaceship landed, UFO landed. And then when he tells the story, he's like, yeah, me and my friend were talking, and then we went our separate ways. It's like, wow, wait a minute. So what's up with the spaceship? So, these are the things that would, make people, ask questions, of course. Another one is a Sermon on the Mount, okay, versus the Sermon on the Plain, right? So it might sound like, making a big deal of it. No, these are things that have been discussed over centuries. Matthew chapter 5, verse 7, the Sermon on the Mount occurs on a mountain and includes the Beatitudes, the Lord's Prayer, and various teachings. Luke chapter 6, verse 17 through 49, you have the Sermon on the Plain, and it occurs on a flat area and contains a shorter version of the Beatitudes and other teachings. So is it just semantics, just not a big deal? Again, these are things that have been debated for hundreds of years. The genealogy, Matthew 1, chapter 1, verses 1 to 17, traces Jesus' lineage through Joseph, starting from Abraham, emphasizing his Jewish heritage. And it contains 42 generations from Abraham to Jesus, whereas in Luke chapter 3, 23 to 38, it traces Jesus' lineage through Joseph, but goes back to Adam, emphasizing universal human connection. Right, in my opinion, it contains about 77 generations from Adam to Jesus. All right, so the genealogies in Matthew and Luke differ, and both the ancestors listed differ in the number of generations. Right, and that, again, without giving any explanation, just showing what can be easily read. Jesus' last words on the cross, for instance, Matthew 27:46, Mark 15:34. Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Right, Luke 23:46. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. John 19:30. Jesus says it is finished. So again, it's one of those things, like, could he have said all the stuff at the same time, right? And just people writing different parts of it down. Okay, it's possible, but these, again, things have been brought up. The timing of the crucifixion, right? Mark 15:25, Jesus is crucified at the 3rd hour, which would be equivalent to 9 a.m. In John 19:14 to 16, Jesus is still before Pilate around the 6th hour, which is the afternoon. So, suggesting the crucifixion may have occurred later in the day. So, what time was it? 7. That is another point. Discovery of the empty tomb. Matthew 28, chapter 1, verse 10. Mary Magdalene and the other Mary find the tomb empty and meet an angel who tells them Jesus has risen. They later meet Jesus. Mark 16:1 to 8. Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of James, and Salome find the empty tomb. They encounter a young man, right, an angel who tells them Jesus has risen. They flee in fear and say nothing. Then Luke 24:1 to 12, several women, including Mary Magdalene, find the tomb empty and are told by 2 men in dazzling clothes that Jesus is risen. And then John 20, verses 1 to 18, Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb alone and finds it empty. She later sees Jesus, though she initially thinks he is the gardener. All right, so inconsistency there is like the number of women, the number of angels, the sequence of events after finding the tomb, etc. All right, so you get the point. I'm not gonna go on with all the more of them, but so you get the point. When we talk about the synoptic problem, so these were things that were discussed in the Christian community in that time, and still being discussed today by those who are interested. And so this book, written by Dr. Schleiermacher, or essay rather, is only on the only about the Gospel of St. Luke. All right, but I had to discuss the synoptic Gospels and what they were, but he's just only talking about St. Luke. All right, so basically, in this particular book, I'll try to put a link down in the description below. Again, please hit that thumbs up button. But in this essay, right, just to break it down, it's a lot to read through, but just to break it down, he basically goes into the origins of the synoptic gospels, right? Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And this essay was like a big landmark at the time in biblical criticism. All right. Oh, one more thing I want to say too is speaking about the synoptic problem. So of course there were several theories addressing the synoptic problem. So I'll just give a few of them real briefly. So one, and I think it's the most widely accepted theory today, is that the Gospel of Mark was the first one to be written, and then Matthew and Luke used Mark as a source. Okay, And so this theory is used to explain why so much of Mark's material appears in the other two gospels. So I guess Mark had the dibs on the information, and the other guys were like, hey, let me get that and copy it down, right? So that's probably the most widely accepted theory. Another theory is called the two-source hypothesis, and this builds on the previous hypothesis and suggests that Matthew and Luke not only used Mark, but then they had access to another source, right? So again, that's speculation, but they're basically saying, hey, they had another source. It wasn't just Mark, but there was somebody else with the information. Okay, and they use that other source to explain why material common to Matthew and Luke was not found in Mark, such as the Lord's Prayer and Beatitudes. So for instance, if you go to Mark, you can't find the Lord's Prayer and Beatitudes. So the argument is if Matthew and Luke copied off Mark, then how is it that Matthew and Luke had the Lord's Prayer and Beatitudes, but Mark doesn't? So this is where that hypothesis comes in, the two-source hypothesis, that, hey, there was somebody else that had the Lord's Prayer. And they said, hey, I want that one. I want the one with the Lord's Prayer and Beatitudes. So that's another hypothesis. Another one is that that rejects that theory of the third source and suggests that Luke used both Mark and Matthew as sources rather than relying on a separate document. Okay, so this reduces the number of sources, but still accounts for the similarity between Matthew and Luke. So it's basically playing musical chairs. So in the first hypothesis is Matthew and Luke using Mark as a source, right? If you bear with me. Pause, right? Matthew and Luke are using Mark, but in the third hypothesis, Luke is using Mark and Matthew. Okay, so first one, Matthew and Luke use Mark as a source, and in the next hypothesis, it's Luke using Mark and Matthew. So it kind of just switching around, and this reduces the number of sources, right? And it still accounts between the similarities between Matthew and Luke. So you can have your cake and eat it too. And then the final hypothesis that I'll discuss is basically, to sum up, is called the two gospel hypothesis. And this theory basically says that Matthew was written first, followed by Luke, and then Mark used both Matthew and Luke as sources, condensing their material. All right, and so again, nobody knows for sure what this does, though. All this speculation does, it definitely throws a monkey wrench in the idea of some kind of divine interpretation, right? Saying that this is infallible word of God, because there's so many discrepancies. Even if you're not trying to be offensive and everything, there's just so many discrepancies that somebody with basic reasoning is going to say this is evidence that this is a man-made document here, right? But that's for a different topic. But I just wanted to discuss this synoptic problem. So back on this particular essay with Dr. F.Schliermacher. Okay, so what he does basically is he focuses just on Luke's gospel, as I said earlier, right? And what he does is he's critical of the theories at the time, right? To explain the relationship among the three gospels. So he's saying, hey, I'm gonna come up with my own hypothesis of and solve the synoptic problem. Okay, so he challenges the assumptions that the writers either directly borrowed from one another or followed a common source document. So he's like, no, this is not what happened. Here's my take. So what he does is he weaves together, different critical methods, theological, ideas, and he's gonna try to shed light on basically how the Gospels, could have been composed. But he's also, him being a theologian, he's also concerned that, again, with all the criticism, like, how is this going to impact this idea that these texts are divinely inspired, right? Because you can't say, hey, this is written by God, it's perfect, it's infallible, but then there's 37 errors in the text, like all type of fallacy, logical fallacies, etc. So this is like the dilemma that he's facing. That he wants to. He it's basically like he wants to be a scientist and theologian at the same time. So he's trying to bring it together where he's trying to weave together a logical, reasonable, coherent argument, but then at the same time not create the idea that hey, this is not a divinely inspired text. So let's see how he gets through this idea. So first he outlines the various hypotheses that I just introduced to you, different ways they are explained, right? And which reveals these differences and similarities between these Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. All right. And basically, he says that historically scholars have been divided into two camps: those who believe the later gospel writers borrowed directly from earlier ones, and then those who believe that all three gospels just drew from common sources, right? Either written or oral. All right. And so the author, he's critical of both approaches. All right. So one of the contributions of his essay is his view of Luke not as an independent author at all. So he doesn't believe Luke is an independent author creating a narrative from scratch, but basically just a compiler of pre-existing materials. All right. So he's saying that Luke's gospel is just a well-organized collection of documents that were already in circulation during his time. Right. According to him, these documents included various traditions, both oral and written, about the life and teachings of Jesus. Rather than trying to alter these materials, his contribution was just basically arranging them. So he combined different pieces of information, some of which came from direct eyewitnesses, while others were second or third hand accounts. All right, so this approach, according to F.Schliermacher, doesn't diminish Luke's authority as an evangelist, but he believes, on the contrary, that Luke's organization, his selection of sources, are seen as his unique achievement. That he's a great organizer, right? And that he also points out that the Gospel of Luke, despite its diversity of style and content, is remarkably cohesive. I would agree with that. You can just read it right through, and that's one of the things I want to point out that always got me about Luke, is that the Gospel of Luke was that it just seems like the styles are different as you read as you read, and so just reading that, he felt like, hey, this is some type of compilation. I could see why he would feel that way, But going on, so he gives him props that, hey, even though this is a compilation, it's still pretty coherent the way it's weaved together, all of these fragments, So his conclusion is that Luke's gospel is a good transmission of earlier traditions. Right, it's independent literary achievement. Right, he did it. He put it together, and he challenges the idea that Luke's gospel is just simply a borrowed or derivative work. He's saying, hey, Luke played an active role in shaping how Jesus' life will be remembered and communicated to later generations. So his essay is not just only to address the synoptic problem, but again, it kind of adds to the debate of biblical inspiration. To me, that's probably the most difficult thing to do. It's hard to critique something that you're saying is perfect because, or divinely inspired, because if it's divinely inspired and perfect, you would your intuition will tell you that there shouldn't be a critique, or all critiques should just be invalid or fall by the wayside. But as we go on in history and more evidence, archaeological things are discovered, right? Different texts and things are dug up. You see that, there were mistakes made, there were errors, right? There were different translations. We know that these texts are translations upon translations, right? That, yeah, you might have a translation in English right now from the Greek that was in Latin at one time, and then the native speakers spoke. They didn't even speak Hebrew. They spoke Aramaic, and it's like all of these translations. This, it's bound to be physical errors and things like that. Now, to me, the only ground people can really stand on is say that the ideas themselves are divinely inspired, right? Looking at it like that, and not to try to look so specifically at certain words or translations and things like that. You would just have to say that the ideas itself, were divinely inspired. But anyway, that was a quick synopsis of the synoptic problem, and also the essay on the Gospel of Luke by the German theologian Friedrich Schleiermacher, again, who is looked at as one of the fathers of modern liberal theology. So he takes the approach that Luke was a mere compiler of previous information, and that he was a good compiler of that, and do not let these the gospel, the problems, the synoptic problem, hinder your faith if you have it in the divine inspiration of the word. So I hope you like that video. Get in the comments below, let me know what you think, and please consider supporting the channel in the links below, and at the very least, just hit that thumbs up button, and I'll see you on the next video.